everyone, my name is Amber, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about what I think are the best books of 2020. So these aren't all 2020 releases, these are just books that I read in 2020 and the ones I would consider to be the absolute best. They're all either 5-star or 4-star reads. I do have more 4-star reads than this. These are just the ones that have really stuck out to me and they're the very top tier 4 stars. So the first ones I want to mention are probably the ones that you're all expecting me to mention, so I should probably get those out of the way first, and that is the David Bad trilogy by S.A. Chakraborty. I'm including the entire trilogy because I reread the first 2 books this year in preparation for the final book, Empire of Gold, and I absolutely adored them. I love this trilogy so much. So the first book, City of Brass, is one that I've reread 3 or 4 times now and I love it every single time. It's about a girl called Nari who is living in Cairo, Egypt, and she is kind of a con artist. She runs a store where she kind of checks people for ailments and tells their fortunes and makes money off of it. The thing is, she does have some sort of like almost ability, she's just not sure what it is yet. And then through various events she runs into the Jinn, and the Jinn take her to Daevabad. Daevabad is the city of brass, and this is where the Jinn is kind of like their capital city. And Nari gets involved in court politics. She meets the ruling family and realizes that they're a bit problematic. She realizes things about her heritage that she didn't know about before because previously she thought that she was an orphan, and it's just an incredible book. It's really well thought out. This book leads into the Kingdom of Copper, which again, 5 stars, it's amazing, and this just builds upon what happened in the City of Brass. The world building is expanded and we learn more about characters that we didn't really know much about previously. And then we have the Empire of Gold, which is the one that came out this year. I read it in May or June I think, and I loved it. This is one of the best series enders I've ever read. Everything comes together. The author does a fantastic job of still building up the characters and the world building as well. New things are introduced that we had kind of heard about in the previous books in the series, and then they come to like their full potential here, and the reader is kind of like, wow, that's where she was going with that, that's so clever. And honestly, this is the best trilogy I've probably ever read, so I would highly recommend reading these. I'm going to reread them next year. I might do a read along if you're interested in that. The next 2 books are also rereads, and I was reading them in preparation for another series ender, and those 2 are The Poppy War and The Dragon Republic. So I read these both I think in 2019. I've read both of these twice now and they're both fantastic. I didn't really like The Burning God. I've done a full review on that if you want to go and check it out. It wasn't great, but I love these 2 books, and I'm not sure I'm going to buy a physical copy of The Burning God because I read it as an ebook and I'm not really sure it's worth it, but I love these books so much. So the first one, The Poppy War, is about a girl called Rin who gets into a prestigious military academy. She kind of works her ass off in order to get in because she is an orphan and she's not very privileged, but most people who go to this academy are. They're all kind of like the private school kids. It's based on true Chinese history. I would say that the series as a whole follows the historical events quite closely in some places, and you can tell that it's inspired, or more than inspired in some places, by these events. I would actually highly recommend reading, if you don't know much about Chinese history around this time period, pre and post World War II, then starting with the rape of Nanking would probably be a good place to start, because I think it would really enhance the experience of reading the Poppy War in particular, because there is an event in there that is quite clearly based on what happened in Nanking. But anyway, I really like these books. It starts off as kind of military academy training. People have said it's like Harry Potter. I don't really think it is. And Rin is trying to prove herself there, and then slowly it becomes more of a military fantasy, and by the time we're at the Dragon Republic and the Burning God, there's like war and inner turmoil and all sorts of things. I would highly recommend it. I didn't love the final book in the trilogy. I gave it 3 stars and it was very disappointing, but the first 2 books are fantastic and a lot of people still did enjoy the Burning God. So if you like the sound of this trilogy, then definitely give it a go. The next one I want to talk about is another 5-star read, and that is The Light Brigade by Cameron Hurley. This is adult sci-fi. It's kind of a timey-wimey sort of thing. So the Light Brigade is basically a group of soldiers, or several groups of soldiers, who are sent up to Mars to fight in the war there, and in order to be basically teleported to Mars, their bodies have to be separated into light and then put back together, and that's how they travel so quickly. It starts off with the main character being a fresh recruit, and then they start to experience the war slightly differently to everyone else for various reasons. I don't want to give too much away because trying to figure it out was one of the best parts of the book for me, and trying to figure out why the main character was firstly on Mars and then suddenly somewhere else entirely, and why the other characters weren't experiencing the war the same way as them. I really enjoyed this one. I love time travel stuff. I love parallel universe stuff. Not that I'm saying that's what this is, but it had those kinds of vibes. And it's just really well written, so I would highly recommend reading this one. It's probably, after The Empire of Gold, the best book that I read in 2020, and I can't wait to reread it, maybe in 2021, I hope so. The next one I want to mention is one that I don't have a physical copy of yet because I got it from the library, and that is Homegoing. This starts off in Ghana. It starts off historical, when the British and the Dutch are going over to Ghana and enslaving the people there. So it starts off with one generation who are kind of in discussions with the British and talking about the kind of start of what becomes the slave trade. And we follow two people from this generation, and then it jumps to their children, and then their children, and then their children. So eventually one side of the family is in the United States, the other side is in Ghana. So we see the developments through US history and also through Ghanaian history and how things have changed there, and kind of the parallels and similarities between them. You see how both sides of the family are affected, even though they both came from the same place. And I love generational stories. I adored this book so much. I gave it 5 stars. Each generation, or each character from each generation, because there are 2 in each generation, they are written so well, and I became so attached to all of them, even though they only had maybe a chapter each. We weren't with any of the characters for very long, but I was so interested in what was going on with them, and I really found it interesting to compare what was happening to one side of the family to the other, or from one generation to the next, like what was going on with them and how things had changed, how things hadn't changed. So I would highly recommend reading Homegoing. Yagyasi is an incredible writer, and I would highly recommend reading their book. The next one I read is one that I want to do a full review on, and I haven't managed to yet just because it's been the end of the year and I've been getting other videos out. But that is A Good Girl's Guide to Murder, and this is a YA thriller. I was not expecting to love this one so much, and I think half the reason that I did love it so much was because it's set in Buckinghamshire, where I live. It's the county in which I live, and I both live and grew up near the places that are mentioned in this book, and so it really kind of made the book more relatable to me, and I could really see how maybe people in Buckinghamshire would snap and murder people, and also how the main character is kind of stuck in village life and knows everyone in the village and is still trying to figure out which one of them is the murderer. It was just really relatable to me, and it's also told in mixed media format, which I loved. So you get interviews and you get text messages. It was a fantastic book, and it was really fast paced. I can't remember, I did figure out the mystery, but I was so engrossed in the book that I just didn't mind. I figured out what the twist would be, but there were also kind of red herrings and things in there that I was sort of following, and I was wondering if those were true as well. So yeah, I thought it was a really well written mystery book, YA thriller, and I'd highly recommend it. I've also read the sequel, but I didn't give that one 5 stars, I only gave it 4, but it was still brilliant. And fun fact, Holly Jackson and I have a lot of mutual friends on Facebook because we grew up around the same area, around the same people, so that's also quite fun for me. The next one I want to talk about is by one of my all-time favourite authors, so it could not be on this list, and that is The Survivors by Jane Harper. She wrote The Dry, Force of Nature, and The Lost Man. The Dry is being turned into a movie next month. Actually, it's coming out on the 1st of January, I think, and I love her books so much. So this one is slightly different. It's not set in the outback. It's actually set in Tasmania, where it's really stormy and gloomy. And this one is about a guy who goes back to his hometown in Tasmania, and he was involved in things that happened kind of like back in the day when he was a teenager, and now more things are starting to happen. And I don't want to give too much away because it's all interconnected, interlinked, and I'm a bit worried about spoiling something, so I'm not going to do that. But I think what I really love about Jane Harper's books is the atmosphere that she creates. Her settings are always fantastic. So when I'm reading The Dry or The Lost Man, I actually felt like I was in the desert and I was dehydrated and I had no water. And then in this book it felt really gloomy. It probably helped that I live in England, and so I could find the weather quite relatable. But at the same time, it felt like I was by the beach when these storms were happening, and I think that is her like true talent. I think she is amazing at crafting the world building, even though it's like real life world building, not fantasy world building. I also read and loved Into the Drowning Deep by Myra Grant. This one is adult sci-fi about killer mermaids. So I have this intense fear of the deep ocean. There's a name for it, but I can't remember what it is. I find the deep water, the sea, the ocean, quite terrifying. So reading a book about killer mermaids was probably not the smartest choice, but I actually really enjoyed this book. I thought it was really well written. There was a lot of sciencey stuff that I found annoying in her previous book, Feed, because I found it to be quite dry. But in this one, I think it really worked because it was a group of scientists, for the most part, going and investigating these killer mermaids along the Mariana Trench. So I think her style of writing really lends itself to this kind of storyline. I loved this book. It had some deaf character representation as well, which I really enjoyed. There was LGBTQ rat, and of course there were really creepy killer mermaids who were slightly terrifying and have not helped with my fear of the ocean. Then I wanted to mention Circe by Madeline Miller. This one is a retelling of Circe, kind of. So Circe is a minor character in Greek mythology. She doesn't really get her own backstory, and she's also a minor character in the Odyssey. In that book, she's basically just a witch who lives on an island, and Odysseus comes across her and it's kind of like over really quickly. But this book is her origin story and then her life story, basically, and I loved it. I thought it's fantastic. It's a lot slower than I think a lot of people would probably enjoy. And I think a lot of people who don't like this book don't like it because it's kind of whimsical and slow. And that's not my usual kind of book, but because I love the Song of Achilles, I wanted to give this one a go. I ended up loving it. I got really connected to Circe. I loved seeing her origin story. I would love for Madeline Miller to do more stories like this, like picking out minor characters from Greek mythology and really expanding upon them, because to be honest, I don't really care about Odysseus. I care about the more interesting characters who have more going on. I started to tab up this book, but I think I'm going to do a reread at some point and then tab it up again and maybe annotate it. And if you would like a video on that, please let me know, because I'm quite happy to video my annotating process. So yeah, I really enjoyed this one. I would highly recommend it. I don't think it's a book for everyone, but if you enjoyed the Song of Achilles, then you kind of know what Madeline Miller's writing is like. So this is very similar to the Song of Achilles, except it's a lot slower, but it definitely has the same kind of writing style. The next one I want to mention is a non-fiction book that I read as an audiobook, and that is Chavs, The Demonization of the Working Class. I am someone who grew up in poverty, basically. Some members of my family are what you would describe as chavs, and so I was immediately drawn into this one because I wanted to know more about how middle class people view the people I grew up around, and how the media and the government have demonized people like that and why. And I found this book to be very informative. I found it also quite relatable, even though I don't think the author is working class or a chav. I think he's actually quite middle class. I still found the amount of research that went into this to be quite good, and like I said, I found it very relatable. The things that he was talking about I was kind of nodding along with, because things like that had happened either to me or to people around me, or they were things I noticed from kind of mingling with like other people, that they had been said by them that they were actually true. Like things I've noticed the kind of more middle class people that I have been around, they have said these kinds of things and they have similar attitudes, and it made me a bit emotional, really. I would definitely recommend reading this book. I'm going to re-listen to it once I start commuting again at some point, because I think it's a good audiobook. I struggle to listen to audiobooks at home, it turns out, but it's a really good book and I would highly recommend reading it. Whether you're in the UK or in another country, really, I think it's quite an important book to read if you want to know more about the class system in the UK and about people living in poverty and about the working class in general. The final book I want to talk about is kind of a surprise book. I wasn't expecting to love it quite as much as I did, and that is The Bone Houses. So this one is about, I keep saying it's about a bone goat, but it's not. So the main character lives in a tiny village and the dead are rising and they're coming out of the woods. And this isn't like cute zombies, they're actually decaying. They want to attack people, zombies. This is happening for some reason and no one knows why. So she goes off into the woods with a teenage boy to try to figure it out. So I don't know if that was the best synopsis. I kind of made it sound a bit generic, but I really enjoyed this one. It has more whimsical writing than I necessarily enjoy, but because I've also mentioned Circe, maybe I am starting to enjoy the more like flowery writing. But again, this is another one that I really enjoyed for the atmosphere. I think the author did a fantastic job of building up the world, but then also because it's quite a short book, she couldn't go into too much detail on it. But this is definitely one that I would recommend to lovers of fantasy books, mythology books as well. I think this is a good one for kind of folk fairy tale lovers, even though it's not necessarily a fairy tale. I'm probably going to reread this one at some point as well because I enjoyed it so much. I did give this one 4 stars rather than 5 just because it was a bit short and it had a few different tropes, YA tropes, that I wasn't a massive fan of. But that said, it's still a really good book. It's just not an all-time favourite, but it's definitely one of the best books that I read this year. So those are the 10 plus books that I read in 2020 and I absolutely adored. So these were my best books of 2020. If you have read any of these, let me know what you thought about about them in the comments below. Even if you disagreed with me, I would be interested in knowing your opinions. Alternatively, let me know what your favourite book of 2020 has been, and I'll speak to you all in the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye.